We talked in the last video about the rise of rhythm and blues in the period leading up to 1955, our birth of rock, but especially the time between 1945 and 1955, and the role of independent labels as they were able to create music that people in urban areas wanted to buy, but they were limited by the amount of distribution they could get, limited by how far a guy could drive with records in his trunk to put them in a record store each week. Major labels, on the other hand, had distribution networks that could get recordings out across the country in relatively short periods of time. And for most of the period up to 1955, the indies and the major labels coexisted fairly easily. That apple cart was upset in 1955 with the rise of rock. But we're anticipating our story. Let's talk now about the rise of regional R&B radio in the 1950s. Now, as I've said before, radio programming started to be directed at an African American audience in these urban areas because radio broadcasters started to realize that there was a significant population to which they could, sell products. And you may think, well, that's a kind of a cynical way to view. But after all, radio is a for-profit enterprise. The music is there really only to get you listening so they can sell you a product. I mean, it seems like a cynical thing to say, but that's the way that business works. If you don't have any advertisers, you can't stay on the air. And so from that point of view, you could say, well, this advertising thing is not such a good thing. But on the other hand, if you think about the fact that we're, at that point, African Americans are living in a very segregated country where there are certain stores they could go into quite innocently to buy something where they could be turned away simply because they were black. There are restaurants where they might go, where they might want to get a meal, but they would be turned away simply because they were black. If they were listening to one of these stations, and they heard an advertiser advertising on their station, they knew they could go to that business, be it a restaurant or a theater or a store or something like that, and their business would be welcomed. So to a certain extent, these radio stations, even though they were about selling advertising and using music that they thought black listeners would appreciate to do so, were actually providing a public service in that they were helping folks out from that point of view. At least that's a kind of a more positive way to think about it. Some of the most important R&B stations that rose up were WDIA in Memphis, and on the air there were Rufus Thomas and B.B. King. You thought he was originally a blues guitarist, and he's always been a blues guitarist, but he was a DJ in Memphis. Also in Memphis, WHBQ, which featured Dewey Phillips, the guy who originally played That's All Right Mama on the radio in 1954 after Elvis Presley had recorded it at Sun Records. WLAC in Nashville, Gene Nobles, John R. Rickberg, and Haas Allen were the DJs there. WGST in Atlanta featured Daddy Sears. Out in Los Angeles on KFVD, you had Hunter Hancock. All of these guys were on the air doing shows that featured exclusively black musicians, R&B musicians. So when Alan Freed comes along in 1951, first in WJW in Cleveland, and starts to put his show on the air, he's already aware that these other guys have been doing this. In fact, there were stories that Freed would call those stations and ask the kinds of things they were playing. Now, not all of these DJs were black, but they sounded black on the air, and so did Alan Freed in 1951. In fact, black listeners would come down to the station to see him when they knew he was finished, and they would be surprised to see this white guy coming out, and they would be, who's this guy? What are we looking for Alan Freed? Well, I'm Alan Freed. Really? I didn't know you were white. Well, this just goes to show that some of these sort of race distinctions that we like to draw are sometimes a little bit more fluid than we imagine. Well, in the case of Alan Freed, he ends up moving with the success of his show in Cleveland to New York, WINS, changing his, the original show was called The Moondog Show, but it turned out there was a panhandler in New York by the name of the Moondog who tried to sue him, so he just changed it to the Rock and Roll Party. Because he changed it to the Rock and Roll Party, and because it was so famous, because it was coming out of New York, he says that he invented the word rock and roll. Well, however that may be, the fact is that because the radio population that had been part of the national audience up to 1945 was now migrating to television, that offered these opportunities in radio, R&B regional radio folks took advantage of that. They started to play a lot of this black music because black folks were now moving up from the rural areas into the northern cities, and so there was an opportunity for to sell advertising on these stations. And so far, so good. Everything's fine. What could possibly be disruptive about the fact that a black community is listening to black music on a black station and going into businesses and frequenting businesses that welcome their business? Everything is fine. But the problem is, or the problem came to be, not a problem for us, we celebrate it, was that white teenagers could also hear those stations. Because just about this time, radios were starting to become portable. You could have a radio in your car. Right? You could get away from what your parents were listening to, and you could listen to this music in the car. You might never be able to go into the neighborhoods where these records are sold. You might never be allowed to go into the clubs where this music is played, but you could turn on the radio and hear it anytime. So what happens in the first half of the 50s is that these shows get rolling because people think they're playing music to black audiences, and they are, but the white teenagers are listening in as well. And people don't find out about this until disc jockeys like Alan Freed start to put on shows where, they put on a show that they think it's going to have all black artists on it. They think it's going to be attended by an all-black audience, and all of a sudden there's all these white kids there, and they're saying to themselves, where did these kids come from, right? And that ability of this regional R&B radio to reach a white audience is to a large extent responsible for how it is that music started to catch hold as the music of America's youth, and it plays a big part in how it is that rock and roll comes to be an important style in 1955.